Hello, everyone. I am Jennifer Chi. I'm the Exhibitions Director and Chief Curator at ISAW. 6.5 years ago, when I walked into Alexander Jones's office on the heels of his highly successful exhibition Before Pythagoras, The Culture of Babylonian Mathematics, and said, "Okay, Alex, what is next?" I don't think either of us dreamed that we would be able to curate an exhibition focused on the concept of Greco-Roman time that included 27 lenders from 7 different countries, and with loans from such prestigious institutions as the Louvre, the British Museum, the Museo Nazionale Archeologico in Naples, and the State Museum of Berlin. At that point, our institution was only 4 years old. Yet we set off on ISAW's most ambitious exhibition journey, trekking together across Europe to view objects that were frequently ferreted away in storerooms, brought out only on the rare occasion that a scholar interested in time-telling might want to view and photograph it for research purposes. What you see in our galleries today, a collection of some of the finest examples of portable and stationary sundials, representations of Greek and Roman calendar systems, objects expressing the emotive, psychological, and cultural meanings connected with Greco-Roman time, and those representing astrological imagery, can never be recreated by a single collection in any American or European museum. It is a tour de force of time-telling imagery, brilliantly evocative of the daily, monthly, and yearly time cycles that organize the ancient Greek and Roman days, and we owe all of this to Alex's extraordinary insight into this most complex subject. Alex has the rare ability to cross disciplines in a seamless manner. At ISAW, he is our professor of the history of the exact sciences and antiquity, the curator of 2 of its most successful shows, and this past year, he was appointed, to the delight of my department, and I am sure all others at ISAW, our interim director. As many of you know, he is a longtime member of the Antikythera mechanism research team, a Hellenistic-geared mechanism which simulated the motions of the stars and planets as they were understood by Greek astronomers. Tonight, in celebration of time and cosmos in Greco-Roman antiquity, as well as Alex's recently published book, A Portable Cosmos, revealing the Antikythera mechanism, scientific wonder of the ancient world, Alex will present to us what I am sure will be a fascinating overview of the oldest analog computer in the world. Please help me in welcoming Alexander Jones.
Thank you very much. Giving the last of the exhibition lectures in connection with Time and Cosmos is a great pleasure, but also a bittersweet experience, because we're very close to the point at which we'll have to say goodbye to the objects that have been adorning our galleries downstairs for the past half year. And many of these, well, really all of them, have come to feel like old friends to I think many of us, certainly to me, as someone who's spent 5 years off and on visiting museums, often in the basements of museums or in storage places, looking at these things, deciding which ones would be most valuable as instructive visual objects to bring together for this exhibition. And now, alas, they will be going back home, and many of them I'm afraid I will probably never see again, so that's a little bit sad. The talk I'm going to give is also, you may think, is a little bit perverse, because its subject it could be called the one that got away. It's an object that we do not have on display and could never, in fact, have borrowed for a loan for an exhibition, because it is simply too delicate and cannot travel, has in fact never traveled from the museum where it is held, which is the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. I'm just going to start very quickly with a few of these old friends that we do have downstairs, which I'm just grouping under a couple of headings to do with what they have to do with time. First, instruments that have the function of observing time or measuring time. These are the ancient counterparts of clocks. And for the most part, they use the sun the sun's light casting a shadow or piercing through an orifice and then sunlight falling on some surface to show the time. Or they used mechanical elements, water driving a floater, which would then drive a revolving disk with pictures of constellations and a marker indicating the sun, again to show the time in a mechanical way. Then there were instruments, mostly in the form of inscriptions, pieces of stone or sometimes ceramic that had text or pictures on them that were not so much meant to measure time but to keep track of time. This was typical for instruments for keeping track of time on the scale of days and larger units up to years and longer. Often they had systems of peg holes where a peg would be moved from one hole to another to mark where you were in various cycles of days, such as a 365-day year or a 7-day astrological week or an 8-day market week. There were also occasionally, and we have the one surviving example from antiquity, mechanical ways of doing the same kind of thing. As the object on the right is a little portable sundial from late antiquity, around the AD 500 or so, that had a component of simple gear work, part of which survives, that allowed you manually to set the display so it would show you which day of the week it was, and on the lost back face it also showed you which day of the lunar month it was. So this was a different way of displaying these cycles. But something you won't see downstairs as an actual present object is a device for simulating time, for showing what happens in time on a scale of time different from reality. When would you want to do that? Well, you might want to slow down really fast actions, or you might want to speed up really slow actions. The one case I can think of from antiquity, which I'll be talking about today, is to speed up the behavior of very slow effects, particularly astronomical effects, but also to some extent social cycles that go on a scale of years, and you want to show how they interact with other cycles on a scale of seconds and minutes. Well, I'm going to tell you about two discoveries, actually, which were independent and happened a little more than 80 years apart, but turned out to be related. And the first one was a library kind of discovery, made by a clergyman of the Catholic Church in the early 19th century, Angelo Mai, who by the time he died in the middle of the century had become a cardinal of the church. But earlier in his career, he had been in charge of the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, and then moved to the Vatican Library, where he was the chief keeper of manuscripts there, starting in 1819. Now, Mai was particularly noted as a discoverer of palimpsests. These were parchment manuscripts from the Middle Ages whose parchment had been considered too valuable to waste on whatever text had originally been written on them. So the pages would be unbound, washed as best one could, and then reused for a second text. And he had discovered several of these in the Ambrosiana Library before moving to the Vatican. And his first major discovery at the Vatican was a manuscript now inventoried as the Vatican Latin manuscript 5757, whose upper text, the dark writing in smaller letters on this sample page, is a book by St. Augustine, a commentary on the Psalms. But you can see between the lines in larger letters 2 columns of writing that turned out to be a book by the Roman orator, politician, and philosopher Cicero. This was a text under the title On the Republic, the same title as Plato's famous dialogue, The Republic, but in Latin. And like Plato's dialogue, it was concerned with issues to do with how to set up a good state, but approaching this from a very Roman point of view. Now, before Cardinal Mai discovered this palimpsest, the only substantial part of this book that was known was an excerpt that survived independently through the Middle Ages called the Dream of Scipio, or the Somnium Scipionis. This is an episode in which one of the speakers in this dialogue, Scipio Aemilianus, a Roman general of the mid-2nd century BC, is made to tell of a dream that he had in which he went up into the heavens, up among the heavenly bodies, where he met his father and his step-grandfather. His step-grandfather was the famous Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal in the wars in the 3rd century BC. And he's shown a vision of the world, about how, essentially, both about the glory of Rome, but also how puny it is in relation to the spherical world that it lies upon and the much larger cosmos of spheres carrying the heavenly bodies, the planets, the sun and the moon and the stars. But what Mai recovered were many, many pages earlier on in this work, which were the dialogue proper, in which 9 Roman statesmen aristocrats conversed on statescraft. And the dialogue turned out to begin with a discussion of astronomy. It has to do with the sort of setting of the well-run state as part of a well-run cosmos. And one of the speakers tells about, who's at this point a middle-aged man, tells about how when he was very young, he was at another gathering of Roman aristocrats, the host of which was the grandson of the Marcellus, who had been the Roman general who conquered the city of Syracuse in Sicily. And this is the event that happened in 212 BC, when the great Greek mathematician who lived in Syracuse, Archimedes, was killed by a Roman soldier who did not know that instructions had been given not to kill this genius who had been responsible largely for the long successful defense of the city against the Romans. Now, Archimedes was famed not just as a mathematician, but also as a mechanician and inventor. And so says this character in this dialogue, the Marcellus Jr., the grandson, brought out for the other guests the one item that his grandfather had taken as personal booty from the conquest of Syracuse, which was a machine that Archimedes had made for showing the movements of the heavenly bodies. And here are just a couple of quotations from this part of the dialogue. The speaker who was at this party, he says, and remember, this is all fictional dialogue, this is not history. He's saying that this kind of sphere, this is the nickname applied to this machine, it wasn't necessarily globe-shaped, in which were present the motions of the sun and moon and those 5 stars that are called wanderers. And the sentence goes on, I'm not quoting the whole thing. The 5 stars that are called wanderers, these are what were called in Greek planetes, which means wanderers. They're the planets that were known in antiquity because they could be seen without a telescope, and they looked like stars but moved among the stars. So this was Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So together with the sun and the moon, which also move among the stars, these were special things that had some complexity of what they did over time. And so this so-called sphere was showing in some way their movements. And he goes on a little later to say one had to wonder at the inventiveness of Archimedes, who had at this point been dead by about half a century or so, that he had figured out how a single process of turning could result in equal and diverse courses of unlike motions, meaning the motions of the planets and sun and moon as displayed on this machine. When Gallus, another of the guests who knew something about astronomy, set this sphere in motion, the moon caught up with the sun in the same number of turnings in that bronze object as it does in days in the actual heavens. So this was a machine simulating time in an accelerated framework. Now, when Mai published this text from the palimpsest pages, he put this elaborate frontispiece in which he shows the 9 speakers of the main dialogue, and at the foot of them, I've put it in a little red oval, there's this little thing that this is what Mai or whoever did this illustration for the frontispiece thought Archimedes' machine might have looked like. And it's basically an armillary sphere, the kind of teaching device that was used from antiquity through to modern times to show the main circles of apparent movement of the heavens. Now, this was wrong. This is not, pretty certainly not what Cicero had in mind when he was making his speakers talk about this thing. Now, in fact, this wasn't the only place in Cicero's writings where he referred to something like it, but it's far and away the most detailed time that he talks about something of the sort. But already there was a text that had already been known when Mai published this material called a book on the nature of the gods. So this is on theology issues in ancient philosophy, in which one of the speakers in that dialogue is making what we would now call an argument by design for the fact that our cosmos was designed by an intellect, some kind of divine mind. And he says, if someone took to Scythia, that means sort of northeastern Europe, or to Britain, this so-called sphere that our friend Posidonius has recently made, each turning of which produces the same behavior for the sun and moon and 5 wandering stars that is produced in each day and night, who in those barbarian lands would question that this sphere was fashioned by reason? So this is clearly talking about the same kind of thing, but this time connected with a much later figure than Archimedes, Posidonius of Apamea, a Greek Stoic philosopher who resided in Rhodes and whom Cicero himself had come to know during his youthful travels in the East when he acquired something of a liberal education, largely visiting Greek philosophers. So just very quickly, I want to indicate this sort of chronology going backwards in time from when Cicero was writing these dialogues in the mid-1st century BC, back to when he was a young man and met Posidonius and perhaps saw this device that one of his characters talks about, and then back to the year of the fictitious conversations on the Republic, in which the still older dinner party from 165 BC is referred to, which again I think we have to understand as a fiction. And further back, we have the fall of Syracuse itself in 212 BC, when Archimedes, an old man who had presumably done much of his work, died. So this is a very long span. And I think when we have Cicero writing in the mid-1st century BC, we have to understand him as talking about things that he knew from his own lifetime, and he's projecting backwards. But I'll come back to that later. Now I'm going to come to the second discovery, and that's the one that's really central to tonight's talk. It's one that was made by Greek sponge divers in 1900 and 1901 as they were making their journey to their diving grounds off the coast of North Africa. Most of the teams of sponge divers at this time came from islands off the coast of Asia Minor, places like Kalymnos and Symi, which are now part of Greece, but at that time were still part of the Ottoman Empire. And when they came to the places where the sponges were, they would dive in this very dangerous brass helmet technology with an air pipe up to the surface for a matter of a couple of minutes a dive to grab sponges and come back up to the surface with them. Now this particular team was heading for North Africa, but the journey was interrupted around Easter time in 1900 by a spell of bad weather, just as they were coming up to the little island of Antikythera, which lies between Crete and the Greek mainland. So there's a passageway into the Western Mediterranean from the Aegean. Now, they had no misfortune in this bad weather. They simply stopped at the island for a few days, and when the weather became better, they took some dives, perhaps to get some dinner or perhaps to see if there were any sponges there. But the diver who went down first found something unexpected, namely statuary on the bottom of the sea. Statues broken in pieces, made of bronze and made of marble. And this was difficult material for them to bring up with their diving equipment and small boats, but they did bring up one bronze statue arm. And after they then went on to their diving season off Africa and then came back home in the autumn, and realizing that they had found something important, they went as a delegation to Athens to meet the Minister of Education, who was responsible for archaeology, and cut a deal with the Greek government that they would dive for the Greek government with the assistance of archaeologists of the Greek government service and the Greek Navy that would provide ships and equipment to haul up large, heavy objects. And so this was one of the first significant exercise in marine archaeology. It was, in fact, the archaeologists realized what the sponge divers didn't at first, that this was an ancient shipwreck site. And the reason there was statuary because this was a ship that had a cargo, that had luxury objects like works of art. There are fortunately some photographs showing the divers from 1901 when they were doing the work for the Greek government. These photographs were taken at a time when there was a group of Greek government officials that were coming to make sure that they were doing the work well. So you see some well-dressed officials in the little boat in the front who are the ministry archaeologists, and then behind them are the team of sponge divers and the other crew of the sponge divers boats. Here's another somewhat sharper photo on board the Greek Navy vessel transport ship called the Mycale, which had the necessary equipment to haul up large objects and could transport them back to Athens as they were found. This is the sort of thing that they were recovering, especially in the early months. They were working from November through the following September, 1900 to 1901. And it was particularly in the earlier weeks of this, during the winter time, a miserable time to be diving in this area, that they were bringing up some of the most spectacular finds, like the head of the philosopher, this scruffily bearded fellow at the left. It was actually his arm that they had brought up earlier. And in fact, most of the bronze statues were only found in pieces, and none of them even nearly complete, except the now quite well-known so-called youth or ephebe of Antikythera, the statue in the middle, almost all of which is original. And all these objects, by the way, are kept in the National Archaeological Museum. There were also a number of smaller bronze statuettes, like the little one on the right. A lot of marble statuary, but this had been very heavily damaged by sea life, things like mussels that would grow on the surface of the marble wherever it was exposed to the seawater and would eat away at the stone. So that where you have a statue like this that's partly fairly pristine surface and partly very messed up, the part that is pristine was buried in the muck at the bottom of the sea, so it was protected for roughly 2,000 years. There was also fine quality glassware, possibly of Alexandrian origin or from Palestine. The sort of stuff one usually finds on ancient shipwrecks is transport amphorae for carrying various sorts of commodities, foodstuffs, wine, oil, and so on. And evidently there were also some passengers on board, because the rather elegant gold jewelry that's here was probably almost certainly not cargo, but the possessions of a woman who was on board. And in fact, there's some human remains were found at the shipwreck site, one of which is a female skeleton. Also, one of the passengers probably had a stash of silver coins that are our best evidence for dating the shipwreck now. And we can say with some confidence that the shipwreck occurred within about a decade of 60 BC, because the latest of these coins was not issued, not later than about 70 or 67 BC. So one can presume there's something of a lag between the latest coin and when the event happened, but not much. It might have been a ship like this in general appearance, very large and capable of carrying heavy objects. There are dives going on now at the site that are hoping to cast more light on the precise nature of this ship, because the original divers, of course, were not able to do very much beyond bringing up a few bits of wood from the hull. Well, what happened? What was the story of this ship? We can make some reasonable guesses from the nature of the cargo and from the likely sources of the statuary, of the glassware, of the coins, of the amphorae. It seems likely that there was a consolidated cargo, that this large ship had assembled a cargo that came from a number of separate sources in the Eastern Aegean. Asia Minor, Pergamon, and Ephesus were the sources of those coins, for example. Kos and Rhodes were where most of the transport amphorae came from. Maybe Alexandria, that's the arrow coming up from the south for the glassware. And they would have been assembled in some place where there was a deep port. Delos is one possibility for this. And then the cargo was clearly intending to go west. I'm suggesting one route that I particularly favor, that would have been going through the passage between Crete and the mainland, out following the northwest coast of Greece, and then doing the short crossing to Brundisium, where the Appian Way began, and the precious cargo could be brought on land. But that's not what happened. This ship also met bad weather, presumably, and was wrecked off Antikythera, and this is what the sponge divers found, therefore. Now, there have been successive visits to the site. 1900, 1901 is the original sponge divers, working, as we would say now, very unscientifically, because they could not do more than just go down for a few minutes, grab what they could, or tie ropes around what was too heavy to bring up themselves. In the 1950s and 1970s, Jacques Cousteau had two dives to the site. The first one was mostly exploratory. The second one, for which there's a television special that if you poke around on the internet you can actually find, was with the cooperation of the Greek Archaeological Service, and did recover a number of additional objects. The coins, for example, were found by the Cousteau expedition, not the sponge divers, and some of the glassware was found by the Cousteau dive. And then since 2014, there have been new, very high-tech, scientifically archaeological dives going on at the site as a collaboration between the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and the Hellenic Ministry of Culture and Sports, which now is responsible for archaeology, which has a division devoted to undersea archaeology. Well, now I finally come to the central object of the talk. which when it was first noticed in the storage rooms of the museum, the better part of a year after it must have been brought out of the sea, was a set of lumps of heavily corroded metal, mostly bronze, that looked in the earliest photographs we have like this. They had not yet been cleaned chemically, they had not been conserved in any way. So they were very heavily encrusted in patina. But the man who first noticed there was something interesting about them, who was in fact the ex-minister of education who had arranged for the cooperation with the divers for the government, who was now out of office, there had been a change of government, saw that the biggest piece of these lumps had some kind of wheels or gears on the surface. You can see some of them on the lower left image and others on the other side of the same fragment. Each fragment, there are 4 fragments here, each shown 2 sides. Also, he noticed that on another of the pieces, that's the one in the upper left, there was writing in Greek letters of ancient style, but seemed to be mirror writing. Now, we now know what happened here was that there was an inscribed plate of metal with writing engraved on that plate that had been pressed against the back of this object and had since mostly disappeared. But what was left behind was a sort of an accretion layer of metal corrosion byproducts that was left with this negative of the inscribed text. So obviously something of great interest. People hoped, among other things, that this would help to narrow down the date of the shipwreck, which at that time was very controversial. But they also were very curious about what would be an ancient Greek object with gears. Because although there were 1 or 2 texts from antiquity that talked about very simple geared devices for things like odometers, there's very little. And this seemed to be something very complicated, even from what could be seen at this point. So all sorts of questions started being raised at that time and have stayed with us, though by now we can answer some of them. What was this device? What did it do? Because there was obviously something mechanical with moving parts. How did it work? In more detail, I mean, not just what were its functions, but how did it accomplish those functions? Thirdly, what's its origin? Who made it? When was it made? Where was it made? Also, for whom was it made? What was its purpose? And lastly, here's what seems like a one-off. We've never seen something like this from an archaeological site before. Were there in fact others like it? Were there lots of others like it, or was it something really rare and we're very lucky to have one? Was there a longer history? Because again, if this is like a snapshot from, as we would now say, about 60 BC, or at least that's when it sunk, were they made earlier, were they made later? Is there any connection with modern gear work like clocks? So early investigators, starting right within days of the discovery, and we can tell this from the newspapers published in Athens at the time, were starting to think about these things and argue about them. But they were dependent on what they could see on these fragments, which was not a whole lot. And their sense was that the fragments were very damaged, that whatever had happened in the shipwreck and after had messed things up so that you couldn't trust what you were seeing to be the original arrangement. Still, there were some things they could say. First of all, it has these mechanical elements. It has these inscribed texts. The inscribed texts were almost entirely illegible at that time, but there were 1 or 2 Greek words that could be made out, either the entire word or at least enough of it that you could tell what was the subject of the word. And among these was the Greek word helios for sun, the beginning of the Greek name of the goddess Aphrodite, but it's also the name of the planet Venus. And a little bit later it was noticed that there was the name of a month of the Egyptian calendar in its Greek spelling. So what this indicated was that it had something to do with time and astronomy. And that's about as far as any agreement could be reached at that time. And I'm showing you 3 of the early researchers or speculators working from 1902 through to the 1930s. The 2 ones on the sides, you can see from their clothing, were officers of the Greek Navy who were very interested in the history of marine technology. And they thought that this was a device that possibly was connected with marine navigation. We no longer believe that, by the way. I'll come back to that later. The one in the middle was a German classical scholar who was visiting Athens, going to and fro to the German excavations in Asia Minor. And he was actually probably the most brilliant of these early investigators in the ideas he got from just a few minutes of looking at the fragments, because he was very knowledgeable about ancient astronomical devices already at this time. But unfortunately, he did publish nothing, or almost nothing. And his notes have sat almost entirely neglected in the Bavarian National Library in Munich since he died in the late 1940s. The real turning point in this story is the work of Derek Desola Price. He was a British physicist turned historian of science and a historian of technology who was very interested in the evolution of clockwork devices, how they evolved from earlier mechanical, especially geared devices through the Middle Ages. And as he was investigating this, he discovered the not very abundant published literature on this mechanism from the sea. And after a number of years of working from photographs, he managed to get a little research grant from the American Philosophical Society, a little over $400, that enabled him to travel to Athens and spend several weeks working in the museum. And although he was working with really no more advanced technology at this point than the earlier researchers, he made the key insights that put the study of the mechanism on a firm footing. First, he realized that the major fragments were not as messed up as previous people had thought, that the gears were in their original places with their original connections. Many of them were broken, some of them were missing. Many of them you could just barely see peeking around corners, but you couldn't really tell much about them. But at least, potentially, the evidence was there for a lot of reconstructive work. So that's sort of the second point, that there was this potential to get the original arrangement. And he realized how the major pieces fitted together originally. And that's also very important because that meant that he got the first insight into what this thing looked like when it was complete, which is essentially the picture that's on your handout. And I'll show it on the screen in a second. So like a box about the size of a shoebox, about a foot tall, half a foot wide. How deep it was front to back, we're not quite sure, but something on the order of 10 centimeters or more, or maybe about half a foot from front to back. And it had two metal faces with lots of dials on them. On the front face, one biggish dial, I mean big in relation to this rather small face, that showed the movements of the sun and the moon. And on the back were other dials, which he was less sure about. But at this point, Price was already talking about this as a calendar computer, a device that was showing cycles of time like calendars and the movements of the sun and the moon that were closely connected with calendars. Price moved away from an idea that Albert Rehm, the German scholar who had worked earlier on this thing, had put forward, which is that it was also a display of the movements of the planets, which would have had to be much more complicated. Rehm was the first person who drew a connection between this device and Cicero's description of devices that showed the movements of all 7 interesting heavenly bodies moving with different rates of motion with a single input drive. So Rehm was really speculating about how it might have done it, but he had that idea, and Price moved away from it to something simpler that's just about time cycles. Now, Price also had a collaborator who was able to help him with reading all those Greek texts inscribed on the fragments. There's a Greek specialist in Greek inscriptions named Georgios Samiris, who was mostly working in the United States but spent holidays in Athens, and he happened to coincide with Price's visit to the museum. So largely through Samiris' work, the first really substantial attempts to transcribe these texts became available, but they were only published more than a decade later. There was still a very large noise-to-signal ratio. Now, these things did not read as ancient Greek. They read like noise with odd Greek words showing up among the noise. So it was really very hard to tell what the texts were actually trying to say, but occasional glimpses of meaning would show up, including some numerals. There were numerals that Price knew were connected with cycles of the sun and the moon. And this is part of how he was able to deduce that there were displays about the sun and the moon. Numbers like 19 and 235, which have to do with calendar cycle for lunar months and solar years, and 223, which has to do with eclipses. I'm not going to explain the details about this. If you're interested in reading about the cycles that we now know were built into the mechanism, on the back of the handout, I've given a list of them. I am not going to talk about them today, but they just show you how complex this thing has turned out to be with the knowledge we now have. And with Price and Samiris, we were just beginning to get some sense of this complexity. Now, a big step in terms of the technology of studying the things came in the early 1970s. Price had always hoped to get X-rays of the major fragments, But in the 1950s, this was not technically possible. The museum did not have space or a power supply capable of doing that. By the early 70s, it was possible to bring in portable X-ray equipment. And a Greek physicist named Karakalos worked with Price, and he and his wife did the radiographs and did the initial counts of teeth on the remaining gears, which were the basis of Price's classic little book called Gears from the Greeks. It was published in 1974, which was the first sort of scholarly study since, well, really since 1903 on the mechanism that gave it substantial new and accurate information about the fragments and made an attempt to reconstruct what it did. This is one of Karakalos's radiographs. So you can see this is the fragment A, the biggest fragment with most of the surviving gears. And you just see how much mechanical complexity is surviving, hiding inside, most of it invisible to an observer from outside because there are other surfaces of plate and so on hiding them. Now, a lot of work has happened since, principally through two separate investigations of the fragments since Price and Karakalos. One, largely the work of Michael Wright, partly in collaboration with an Australian historian of computers named Bromley. Bromley died before they got very far with making sense of their data, but Wright is very much with us and has published a lot of brilliant articles on the mechanism. They were working still with direct examination, with radiography. They also had portable X-ray equipment. And Wright built a special X-ray device that allowed one to get a sense of depth within an X-ray by mechanical means. This is not the tomography of modern computed tomography like medical tomography, which I'll come to in half a second, but a mechanical sort where you can get an X-ray image that has sharp focus on one level and gets increasingly fuzzy as you go above and below that level. So it gives us three-dimensional information about a three-dimensional machine that Price had lacked and that was a serious impediment to his making sense of what he was seeing. Now, Wright solved many puzzles about what was actually there. He also made very forceful arguments, but they were still, to some extent, speculative arguments that even though everything that was actually surviving seemed to point towards sun, moon, calendars, and time cycles, that there must have been a display of the planets too. And this would have been on the front with the movements of the sun and the moon through the zodiac, but that all the mechanical parts, the pointers, the gears, were lost. And he had arguments for this, not just appealing to the ancient literature that talked about planets, but also little vestiges that no one seemed to be able to explain unless they had some additional function that wasn't already accounted for. Then, more recently, a biggish team that's partly academic, astrophysicists, classical scholars, and tech people from the curators from the National Archaeological Museum, and tech people from Hewlett-Packard and from a British company that was making tomography equipment for things like studying stress on jet turbines. So very high resolution, high energy computed tomography, did scanning of all the fragments of the mechanism in 2005. And this acquired a lot of new data. By this time, the museum was not letting any outsider touch the fragments. Wright and Bromley were the last outsiders who were ever allowed to handle the pieces themselves. So we're now dealing entirely with gathered data, not with direct manipulation of the pieces. There are now 82 identified pieces. I would not vouch for all 82, by the way. Some of them certainly have bronze in them and have not been identified as anything other than pieces of this mechanism. Particularly, the cluster up in the upper left, for example, we don't know actually was part of the mechanism, but they seem to come from the shipwreck, and we don't know what else they would belong to. But the great majority of these were pieces. Many of them were part of the original 4 fragments that have since either broken off or been deliberately removed from the original fragments through conservation work. And some of them turned up since in the museum storage. They just weren't noticed in 1902, but they've been lying around. So you can see and these are tiny. The biggest fragment, fragment A in the middle, is about that big. So you can get some sense of how tiny pieces like these in the high numbers are. But many of them have 1 or 2 Greek letters on them, and there's this wonderful exercise of doing the jigsaw puzzle of trying to fit them into the text. So we're now pretty sure of the outside look of this thing. This is the diagram I have in the handout. I'm just showing you the approximate estimated scale for the dimensions. We're not sure about the depth, but you can assume at least about that much front to back. And you can see that there are lots of dials. One complex dial on the front, which is the one with the sun, moon, and planets moving around the zodiac. And on the back, there were at least, well, probably just, but still a lot, 5 dials. 2 big spiral ones and 3 little subsidiary dials inside the spiral ones, with rather complicated pointers for the spiral dials, because the pointer has to ride in a spiral slot that runs round and round, changing radius. Also, the text, we can read much, much better now. This has been some of the most recent substantial work, which I've been actually quite a bit involved in, of working through especially the tomography data to get, basically not only to read more, but to get the noise out. And so we now can identify, following Price. Price had actually identified the 4 major texts, but he wasn't able to make much out of 3 of them. That there are these 4 distinct texts which are doing different things. The 2 upper ones, which are actually on the faces of the mechanism, were adding information to what the dial showed. And the 2 remaining ones that were on the separate plates that seemed to have been stuck on the back and the front while it was undersea for 2,000 years. So they may have been like, sort of additional instructional material with the device, were explaining about what you were seeing, what the meaning of the dials was, and about what was the assumed astronomy built into the mechanism. So being able to read these better and know what they're trying to do is hugely valuable for us in understanding things beyond what the actual remains have. So here's Fragment A, what we call the back face of it. And you can see that there are a lot of remains of large and small gears visible there, and also some material in the lower left, which is on top of the back plate. And here's Fragment B as it originally sat on top of this. And if you look at the parts of the actual back plate of the mechanism that are poking out from behind the inscription material, you can sort of extrapolate to this back face with the 2 big spiral dials and the 3 smaller ones. One of those smaller ones does not actually survive. We infer it from the inscribed text, but the other 2 are still present on the back plate, though you can't see them looking at the fragment without X-rays because they're hiding behind other stuff. And so this is what we have. The big upper spiral is a calendar cycle running for 19 years, which coordinates solar years with the lunar months that Greek cities used. And the right-hand little subsidiary dial, the one that actually survives, was a 4-year cycle that is labeled with the famous games that were the Pan-Hellenic games, like the Olympic games that were across all the separate Greek states. These were religious cult events with athletic components that people would travel to from throughout the Greek-speaking world, either to participate in or to be spectators in. Plus another couple that were minor games, and those are also interesting. And the lower part is all to do with eclipses. It's that 223-month cycle, that number 223, that Price discovered on one of the fragments. This is a cycle for predicting when eclipses could happen. And if they could happen, what time of day or night would be the middle time of the eclipse. And some other data to do with the eclipses if they happen. So it's not definite eclipse prediction, but probable eclipse prediction. So this is a blow-up in translation of a bit of the calendar spiral, and you can see that there are all these cells with Greek words that are the names of months of a calendar. It's a calendar that we can now identify as the calendar that was used in northwest Greece, the part of the mainland near the island of Corfu. It's otherwise known pretty well entirely from inscriptions from that area. But the structure of the calendar we recover from this dial. And then with the little dial, you can see that the years are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and outside the dial are the names of the competitions, which include the famous cycle of 4, the Olympics, the Isthmians, the Nemeans, and the Pythians, but also 2 less famous games called the Haliea and the Naa. Now, just to show a bit of geography here, I'm underlining where the 4 famous Pan-Hellenic games were. They're not particularly important for understanding the mechanism because they were so famous that these tell us nothing about the place where it was made or the place it was made for. But these are the places where the 2 additional ones were. One is Rhodes. Now that's a city or an island we've already heard about. This is where Posidonius, the philosopher, was living when Cicero met him, and where Cicero may have seen this device that he says that he had for showing the planets. And Rhodes was also a source of some of the ceramics on the ship. Dodona, this was a major cult site of Zeus in northwest Greece, the very area where the calendar of the mechanism was in use, this area called Epirus. So it looks as if maybe we have one game that is associated with a place where the mechanism might have been made, and another for the place where it may have been made for, and for which its calendar was fitted. So this is where, basically, this is roughly Epirus' area. For the eclipses, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there are these little coded texts that are talking about there may be an eclipse of the moon, there may be an eclipse of the sun in the month that corresponds to a cell that has a text in it. Most of the cells are empty, meaning an eclipse is not going to happen when the pointer is pointing at this cell. But if a pointer is pointing at a cell with text, it would say it's worth watching for an eclipse of the moon or the sun, or maybe both. Now, we also now can reconstruct with very little doubt practically the whole operation of the sun-moon calendar part. And this is essentially something that everybody seriously working on the mechanism now agrees upon. In fact, the great majority of these gears are still there in whole or in part. Some of them are damaged enough that we cannot be objectively sure about how many teeth they had, but when we understand the astronomical functions and we can read what the dials say, as we now can, we can be sure of what all the numbers of teeth were, what the connections were between the gears, and basically how this whole module of the mechanism worked. Starting with the time input, that's a sort of knob or crank on the side. On the diagram on the handout, this is labeled A. You would turn that clockwise to go forward in time, or turn it counterclockwise to go backward in time. And you would need about 5 or so turns of the knob to go forward 1 year. So that's the sort of scale of time we're talking about. This thing could just barely show the scale of time on days, but it's really for months and years and longer. So here's the one surviving piece of the front face with, again, some inscription plate on top of it, hiding part of it. But you can see that there are dial scales there that look like a modern protractor, divided into units that are about 1 degree each. The inner one is, in fact, divided into, or was, when complete, divided into 360 degrees. The 360 degrees of the zodiac circle, divided into 12 signs of the zodiac. And this was the scale used in ancient Greek astronomy, inherited from the Babylonians, to describe positions of heavenly bodies as they were moving through the sky. The outer dial scale is inscribed with 365 marks when it was complete, and it was the Egyptian calendar year. It allowed one to correlate Egyptian calendar dates with where the sun is pointing on the mechanism. So again, we can extrapolate what the original would have looked like reasonably well. And this is partly using the text, partly using physical remains, that it would have been a display with probably just 7, but 7 is a remarkably large number, of pointers radiating out from the center, 1 each for the 5 planets and the sun and the moon. So the pointers would show you the position in the zodiac in sign and degrees that in this simulated time were occupied by each of these bodies. The bodies themselves would be represented visually by little colored balls mounted on the pointers, except for the moon, where the moon was actually showing, it was a little half white, half black ball that was visible through a circular window. And as the gearwork operated, this ball would be turned to show you what the current phase of the moon looked like for whatever date you're showing. And actually that apparatus survives almost complete, minus the ball itself, but with the gearwork driving it on the back of that Fragment B, that's the one piece with the front of the mechanism. Just to give you some idea of these texts that have gone so far to illuminate the parts that were missing, and especially the planetary part. This is that backward text that was seen by the ex-minister back in 1902 in the museum. I've mirror reversed the image. This is a reflectance transformation image. This is the Hewlett-Packard work that is using digital photography to transform into a file where you can modify, say, in a simulated way, the reflectance properties of an object. So you can enhance surface features like inscriptions. You can factor out discolorations that might interfere with visibility of these features. So this, in this form, it's almost as if it's sprayed with metal and bringing out the shape without the colors. And we can read quite a lot of that, though actually the tomography is even better than the reflectance transformation image for reading this stuff. And a large part of this is talking about the pointers in their order of how far they were believed to be from the Earth. And so this is one of the key documents for telling us what the front display showed. Much, much harder for reading is this inscription. This is the so-called front plates. It was stuck on the front of the mechanism fragments when they were found in 1901, 1902. It is so corroded that it was, until the tomography data became available, almost nothing of this could be read. Now we can read maybe about 3/4 of it. The gaps are just so badly damaged that even with that data, we cannot make out legible words for the most part. But what we can read now is very illuminating in conjunction with the other one. The other part tells us about what was shown on the front. This text is telling us about how it was supposed to work in time. What were the cycles of planetary motion? The surviving part is all about the 5 planets. Nothing surviving on this about the sun and the moon or the calendars. That may have been in the lost parts before and after what we have. Because maybe only about 1/3 of the original plate is surviving here with, as you can see, holes in it. So the front display, in other words, was a kind of display of a cosmology in motion. It's not just a kind of a device showing data, but something that's showing a picture of the universe as if you were looking at it sort of godlike from outside, seeing the way that almost all Greek astronomers assumed. The Earth is a circle at the center, or sphere at the center, I should say, and then surrounding it are shells, which in reality were assumed to get bigger and bigger as they go out, but you can't do diagrams showing that, so it's done schematically as if they're all like layers of an onion. So the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the zodiac represents the stars that are furthest out. And this would have been sort of what the front face would look like, but with all these moving pointers representing the heavenly bodies. Now, one thing about planets is that if you're going to have a meaningful display of how planets move through the zodiac, those pointers are not just going to move with a uniform rate as you're cranking time forward. They're going to go forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards. We would say, from our sort of after Copernicus point of view, with the sun at the center of a solar system, that we're seeing a planet orbiting the sun, but from another planet orbiting the sun. So we're seeing a complicated motion that's 2 almost circular movements combined. And that's why you get the sort of looping effect with planets appearing to backtrack periodically. Well, that wasn't how ancient Greek astronomers explained this, but they knew that it happened. And they had their own explanations that were involving combinations of circles too. But how did they do it with gear work? Well, all the planetary gears are lost. So we don't know, but we can guess some of the ways that it might have been done, because there's something similar that survives for the moon. It doesn't make the moon go backwards, because the moon doesn't reverse direction in the zodiac, but it does speed up and slow down in its apparent movement through the signs of the zodiac. And this was simulated very successfully by gears that do survive. It's a way of connecting gears that doesn't use just connections by teeth, but uses one gear above another, where one is driving the other using a pin that rides in a slot in the other gear. And if one is slightly off center of the other, you're going to get the same average rate of revolution for the 2 gears, but if one is turning uniformly in speed, the other will speed up and slow down. And in the mechanism for the moon, this was done in a way that is basically astronomically correct, with for anyone familiar with the astronomy in the audience, with a moving lunar apogee that shifts at approximately the correct rate, so that the fast and slow movements occur with the right periodicities. So, back to the questions. What did it do? We now know this pretty close to 100%, I would say. Parts of it because they survive, parts of it because we can infer it from the text. And that's what I've really been talking about, so I'm not going to recapitulate it all. How did it work? We know maybe about 2/3 of that. Certainly we know the sun and the moon part. For the planetary gear work, we have hints of the kinds of devices that might have been used, but we cannot reconstruct the details. For when and where it was made, this is getting more speculative. The date is still very controversial among the researchers working on this. I have friends and colleagues who work on this material who have quite good arguments for pushing it back to around 200 BC based on the cycle of eclipse predictions, because we can date that cycle. And it starts from an eclipse, or actually, well, simply from a lunar month in the spring of 205 BC. I don't think this is right for dating the mechanism. I think it's probably much closer to the date of the shipwreck. It was essentially new, and likely it was being delivered to its intended owner. And I think that eclipse cycle is deceptive because it's essentially backdated data. But it's an argument I don't want to get into in detail now. But in other words, there is about a 150-year window within which serious and competent researchers would date this, but we're not in agreement where in that window it goes. Also, we're not sure about where it was made, but I think Rhodes is the most popular candidate. And the calendar information is really indicating that it must have been destined for someone in a part of the Greek world where that calendar was used, and that really is quite localized too. So the voyage of that ship was going the right way for it, but maybe there's a more complicated story. They're going back and forth. We don't know. Well, who might have had such a thing? The one person that we can say for sure had such a thing, almost for sure, is Posidonius, who was living in Rhodes just about the date of this shipwreck, around the 70s, 60s BC. Now, he wasn't a mechanician himself. He was a philosopher. And when Cicero says he had one of these things made, I think we can be pretty sure that he went to a workshop where such things were made, and maybe might have provided some of the astronomical data, or maybe this is something they already had an expert for. We don't know. But there must have been some kind of a collaboration between someone with astronomical knowledge and certain mathematical skills for breaking up astronomical periods into feasible gear ratios with numbers of teeth on the gears that are not too big. You don't want 500 some teeth on a gear, and you also don't want a gear with only 3 teeth because that's not going to work. So you need things that go from maybe around 12 up to the low hundreds as the possibilities. And that's got to be worked out with someone with a lot of mechanical skill and a lot of skill with working with shop equipment, things like files and lathes and so on, to make something like this. It's teamwork, in other words. Well, so was this a one-off? Well, almost certainly not. Posidonius allegedly had something quite similar. No shop that could do this is likely to stop with making one working model, nor is it very likely that a random shipwreck would preserve that one working model. So probably this represents a series that was made by that shop. Can we go further than that? Did Archimedes make such things? Well, I think we should be very careful about believing what Cicero says about Archimedes' devices if this is a historical account, because as I say, this is philosophical fiction that we're reading when he talks about Archimedes. And Cicero was a great worshiper of Archimedes as an intellectual hero whose tomb he had rediscovered when he was a young Roman official in Sicily, for example. So I think there's a lot of projection backwards. Cicero may have made something astronomical with some mechanical elements, but it's unlikely to have been this complex. For the later history, all we can say is that there are later mentions of such things. For example, in the 2nd century AD, Galen and Ptolemy, great scientists of that time, talk about such things, so they seem to exist then. And then in later antiquity, we have that geared sundial, which is way simpler. It's not anything like the sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism, but it shows at least of the very basics of using gear engagements to represent time cycles and the ratios is still there. And it continues to crop up in the Middle Ages, in the Islamic world, and then in medieval Europe, tending to be in the context of geared attachments to devices for other purposes, like the geared sundial. Later on in later medieval Europe, you get astrolabes that have geared attachments with a similar sort of what day of the week is it function to them. And then you get the great surge of complex astronomical clock technology in late medieval Europe, which is reviving many of the clever devices that were in the Antikythera mechanism, but I think more likely rediscovering them than somehow tapping into a submerged tradition of high-end stuff. That's my feeling, but again, I have colleagues who are pretty convinced that there is somehow a latent, continuous tradition of high-end gearwork astronomical devices that we just aren't seeing the witnesses of over the intervening roughly 1,500 years between the Antikythera mechanism and the next things that are all like it. So, I mean, believe what you like. Maybe someday we'll find some intermediate thing that would help us to answer this question. But I'd be very surprised if we did. But anyway, that's basically where we are now. It's not an enigma anymore. It's a very interesting object, and the challenge now is to make sense of it within ancient Greek culture. And that's basically where I'm now approaching the study of this thing, but that's a story that I could hardly touch on in this talk. So I'm just going to stop here and take any questions that you have. Thank you.